We have gathered today in these beautiful hills to remember a special little girl named Sadako Sasaki and many others like her whose lives were cut short or forever changed in August of 1945. We remember Sadako not only because she was one of the victims of the twin atomic bombings in Japan, but because she managed to spread a message of love and peace despite the terribleness that she met at a very young age. And we remember the resiliency emerging from the rubbles of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that the Hibakusha embodied with every attempt to put together pieces of their broken cities, their lives, and their bodies. The International Red Cross Hospital in Hiroshima treats Hibakusha for leukemia and other cancers to this day. Sadly, the widespread death and destruction and suffering due to the nuclear weapons used in Japan did not seem to register in quite the appropriate way with the civilian and military leadership in the United States. Less than a year after the attacks on Japan, the United States began testing nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, a remote collection of coral atolls in the Pacific, ultimately using the equivalent of 7,000 Hiroshima bombs, or 1.4 Hiroshima bombs every day for a period of 12 years. Instead of just Sadakos, there were now also Lemoyos, little boys and girls whose growing bodies were exposed to nuclear fallout from a test that was the equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. And then there were girls and boys all over the United States exposed to nuclear fallout from tests conducted in Nevada and New Mexico and elsewhere. Most affected were the children in the American Southwest, where nuclear fallout arrived following each atmospheric test, and the radioactive isotopes found their way into the food, water, soil, and young children's bodies. As if the impacts of nuclear testing hadn't been enough, the people of the region also suffered, most acutely in the Navajo Nation, from radiation exposure due to uranium mining. But it wasn't just our own country that harmed the innocent and the vulnerable through the development and testing of nuclear weapons, thus attaining the seemingly invaluable status of a nuclear power. The Soviets did it in the deserts of Kazakhstan, where to this day, children born with severe birth defects due to parental exposure to radiation are taken care of in state orphanages under suboptimal conditions. The British did it on Christmas Island, which today is part of the Republic of Kiribati, and in sites in Australia near the indigenous populations. The French did it both in the Algerian desert, where they buried radioactive equipment in the sand, and in French Polynesia, where recent research indicates that the exposure to radiation was far higher than what the French government had claimed. And the Chinese did it in the Xinjiang region near several ethnic groups, including the Uyghur, Han, Hui, Kyrgyz, and Mongol. My own research with colleagues and students at Columbia University suggests that the levels of radiation in the Marshall Islands remain unacceptably high in former testing sites and nearby atolls. So these are not just old problems, these are current challenges. And yet, out of each and every example of nuclear weapons harm was born a determination to share their stories with the world, as such knowledge and experience represents important lessons for us all. First comes the lesson on the harm done so that we can right the injustices of the past. Next comes the lesson for the present so that we can pursue nuclear disarmament until the very last nuclear warhead is destroyed. And last comes the lesson for the future so that we don't make the same mistakes when new and potentially dangerous technologies come our way. There is good news on the horizon, as Frank indicated. Last year, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, came into force after 50 states ratified this historic agreement to ban nuclear weapons, their development, their testing, their use, threat of use, and more. In June, also as Frank indicated, I attended the first meeting of states parties in Vienna, by which time the list of parties to the treaty had grown to include 66 countries and counting. The Nuclear Age Peace Foundation will continue to work tirelessly to strengthen this treaty by encouraging and supporting more countries to sign it and to ratify it. But the treaty does more than just ban nuclear weapons. It also has provisions for victim assistance in environmental remediation, focused in particular on communities affected by nuclear weapons testing and development. In this way, TPNW is the first arms security agreement that has a humanitarian component. That, in and of itself, is worth celebrating. It is a way to honor Sadako and Lemoyo and everyone else whose life was forever impacted by nuclear weapons. It is a way for us to move forward towards a world free of nuclear weapons while assisting those most harmed by them. I would like to end with some personal remarks. When the Sadako Day invitation arrived at my house, as I assume it did at yours, I went around to each family member to show them the invitation. My husband, Emlyn, and my son, Mitya, who's 17 years old, both commented on the beautiful design of the invitation, the thoughtful text, the touching story. My daughter, Inga, who turned 21 last week, read through the invitation, and when she came across my name, she sort of gave me this look like, "Mom, I'm so proud of you." And then there was my son, Nemanja, who is 11. Nemanja sat at the dining room table very carefully reading the entire brochure. And when I thought that he had been reading long enough, I sort of stood there to get his reaction. And I realized that his face had started to change and that his eyes had filled up with tears. He looked at me and he said, "She died, didn't she?" And I said, "Yes, she did." And I walked over and I gave him a hug. By this point, he was crying and I was crying too. And I said, as I was hugging him, I said, "But this is why Mom is working towards a world free of nuclear weapons, so this never happens again to another little boy or another little girl." At that point, he got out of my embrace. He's 11, so, he was ready for, the mom hug to end. And he picked up the invitation again, and he almost angrily said, "You need to send this to President Biden so that he would get rid of he would destroy," that's what he said, "so that he would destroy all of our nuclear weapons." And I really think that if an 11-year-old can put the story of Sadako and nuclear disarmament, can put the two and two together, I think it's high time that the adults, the so-called adults in the room, do the same. I hope that you will enjoy the beautiful program that we have prepared for our gathering today. I'm so happy to be here with all of you and taking to heart Sadako's message of love and peace. NAPF is proud to continue in its mission for a just and peaceful world, one that is free of nuclear weapons. Thank you so very much.